Carolyn L.
Bird.
The old Russian must have been 100 years old if he was a day. He had a face like gnarled mahogany, from which sprouted a great, shaggy white beard that reached down to his waist. He sat on a mountain of embroidered cushions, smoking a yellowed pipe, and his eyes, although half obscured by pouches of ancient flesh, were bright and black like a snake's. His clothes were curiously old-fashioned and made from expensive silk, the jacket in scarlet, and the voluminous pantaloons in bright ochre. The latter were tucked into shiny boots, which themselves were inlaid with a tracery of silver. On his head was a tall astrakhan fur hat, which gave him a hint of noble bearing, and I took him to be a rare aristocratic survivor of pre-1917 Russia. He saw me staring at him and seemed amused.
Come here,
he said suddenly, beckoning with his pipe, and I was surprised that he spoke English, albeit with a throaty Russian accent. Something about those glittering black eyes drew me to him at once, and I sat on the cushions next to him.
Your name, boy?
He demanded, breathing twin jets of smoke from his nostrils. Paul Stevenson, I said at once, my 15-year-old lilt contrasting strangely with his gravel tones.
On holiday?
He said, almost accusingly, and I nodded. In those days I was a nervous youth, virtually in terror of all adults, and this ancient Russian seemed more terrible than anybody I'd ever met.
What do you think of Istanbul?
He said.
Strange place for a holiday, eh?
I glanced around, hoping to catch a glimpse of my father, so that he might rescue me from my predicament, but he had vanished into the depths of the bazaar. The old Russian seemed to sense my discomfiture, and his face creased into a smile, transforming that hitherto ferocious visage into a semblance of friendship.
Come now,
he said.
Speak up, boy. I won't eat you.
I smiled weakly and fidgeted with my straw hat, which I had automatically removed. If you please, sir, I said, I'm waiting for my father. The old Russian sucked at his pipe, his mouth and cheeks puckering like a leather glove.
And who might your father be, then, boy?
Sir George Stevenson, of the Foreign Office, sir. At this information the old man's eyes glittered, and he extended a brown, horny palm. Nervously I took it, and we shook hands. His left hand, I noticed, he kept tucked inside the folds of his tunic.
Would you like to hear a story, boy?
He said.
A yarn you can take back to Scotland with you.
England, sir, I blurted with unexpected courage.
Ah,
said the Russian.
England, of course. No matter. I shall tell you my tale, and you will listen, and you will marvel at it, and perhaps when your father returns he will buy some of my beautiful silks to take home.
He laid down his yellow pipe in a dish and pulled back the sleeve that obscured his left arm. There was no hand at the end of the wrist, just a nub of pinkish flesh that terminated an inch below the elbow.
I will tell you how I came to lose it,
he continued, ignoring my sharp intake of breath.
It was in the winter of 1854, and I was a young student in Tashkent, impecunious and in love. The object of my adolescent passion was a woman some years my senior, although still young herself. She was the wife of a wealthy merchant who was away on business in Persia, and I begged her to leave him and set up home with me. Of course she rejected this offer, regarding me as little more than a diversion, a plaything, to while away her leisure hours. I continued to plead with her until she became angry. We quarreled bitterly, and eventually, to my great humiliation, she terminated the affair and sent me packing. Only those who have experienced the bittersweet agony of adolescent love could understand just how badly I felt. A kind of madness overwhelmed me, and I quit my studies, resolving to become a nomad and wander the Siberian wastes, alone for the rest of my life. For nearly a year I did just that, drifting from village to village, subsisting on berries and nuts and the occasional hunk of bread begged from peasants in the field. The Russian winter is the cruelest in the world, and I suffered frostbite which took off 3 of my toes. At length I came to my senses and decided to seek employment. It wasn't easy, for my brain had grown idle with the nomadic drifting and the scourging cold. I found a tiny village near the Caspian Sea, and there, after much pleading, I obtained a post as a scullery boy to the local priest. He was a loathsome, pious cleric with great fat, beringed fingers and a perfumed beard. He had the appetite of a bear, and I was kept very busy in the stone-flagged scullery, preparing vegetables and stripping meat for his 6 meals a day. The church in which he officiated was a superb old building dating back to the 12th century, with a golden minaret and fabulous twisted columns, not unlike a smaller version of the famous St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. After some weeks in his employ, the priest allowed me into the church itself, and I helped another servant to clean the various holy ornaments. This fellow was something of a dullard, and looked upon the task as no more than just another chore. I, however, was dazzled by the splendor of the objects we handled. Superb icons with tiny painted figures of the saints, solid gold scepters encrusted with emerald and lapis lazuli, silver crowns from the Holy Roman Empire. How they came to reside in this obscure Russian village I'll never know. Numerous chalices, all gold, and many other priceless items. Months passed, and the brief summer made life more tolerable. I became used to the concept of labor, and even began to enjoy it. The priest was a man of gross habits, and one morning I caught him by chance ravishing a peasant girl behind the altar. He was so incensed at being discovered, he beat me savagely with a knout, and banned me from setting foot inside the church again. Henceforth, I was to confine myself to the kitchens and to the duties of a scullery boy. This was a grave disappointment to me, as I had become obsessed with the fabulous treasures of the church, and loved to handle them and polish them until they gleamed like the sun. I had taken to laying awake at nights and imagining what I would do if they belonged to me. My fantasies included a country dacha outside Moscow, a big townhouse, servants, fine clothes, crates of French champagne, a box at the opera. How I dreamed. I recalled, with pangs of melancholy, my abortive love affair with my merchant's wife in Tashkent, and how cruelly she had used me. It was then that the germ of an idea began to form in my mind. Supposing I took some of the treasures from the church, not so many as to be conspicuous, but enough to make me moderately rich. I could sell them in a distant city, return in triumph to Tashkent and claim my lady love, who, seeing her young ex-beau emerge as a prosperous businessman, would surely not hesitate in leaving her husband and starting a new life. This mad notion filled my every waking moment, until eventually it became an obsession. I would do it. I would succeed. Summer passed, and the air took on an icy chill as the wind blew off the steppes, and the trees turned cold and shed their leaves. The villagers pulled the shutters over their windows in preparation for winter. As the first snow began to fall, I resolved to put my plan into action. It was full of skill and daring, and I was very proud of it. At midnight on a Saturday, I crept from my pallet of skins behind the kitchen range and made my way to the stables. The horses were restless in their stalls, pawing the ground and snorting. I selected 2 of the liveliest and led them out into the moonlit yard. Here I harnessed them side by side to a large sled with rugs and the boxes of food from the kitchen, and positioned it alongside the church. The next part was the most dangerous, and my heart was pounding like a blacksmith's hammer. I scaled the ivy-clad wall of the church and clambered in through a tiny stained glass window, which I had previously loosened in its lead frame. Inside the church, fat yellow candles burned on the altar, and it smelled of incense and stale human sweat. Slowly, painstakingly, I selected my booty and carried it piece by piece out through the window and stacked it under the rugs on the sled. It took me nearly an hour to complete the task, and the night had grown bitter with intermittent flurries of snow. It would have been easier had I been able to gain access by the main church door, but I knew it was double locked by the priest each night before he retired. Eventually, I decided that I had enough treasure to make me a comfortable fortune, even if I sold it at a fraction of its true value. The sled was loaded with 4 gold scepters, 2 jeweled crowns, numerous rings, and some silver-encrusted tapestries of Byzantine design. Stealthily, I settled into the driver's seat and picked up the reins. The horses, their black bodies dusted with snow, needed very little encouragement, and as I flicked their haunches with the long, gleaming coach whip, they plunged forward with a jangle of harness. The main street of the village was narrow, and it was impossible to go fast, so I held the prancing horses to a trot as we maneuvered the twists and the turns. We rounded a particularly sharp bend, and the sled runners hit a patch of bare cobblestones on which the snow had melted. The scraping noise made the horses swerve violently, and we became wedged against the wall of a tiny cottage. Cursing, I leapt from the sled and tried to push it away from the obstruction, but my feet slithered in the snow. I sprang back into my seat and slashed the whip across the horses' backs. They reared in their traces, and the leathers creaked. Then they plunged forward, straining to gallop. The sled rasped along the surface of the wall, and we were free. The commotion, however, had disturbed the village, and I saw candles gleam behind the frosted windows. I urged the horses on, anxious to reach the pine forest at the outskirts of the village, while behind me I heard loud cries and the slamming of doors. We slithered into the market square, and I loosened the reins, giving the horses their heads. As I skimmed into the big open space, I saw a group of figures running towards us. Local militiamen, muskets at the ready, and the officer in charge was waving frantically for me to stop. With the wisdom of hindsight, I now know that I should have heeded the command. But instead, with growing panic, I attempted to ride straight through them. When they saw my intention, they scattered like ninepins and rolled sideways in the snow. I heard the hoarse cry, and then the deafening crack of a musket. A split second later, my left elbow was shattered as the shot found its target. The impact threw me forward in the sled, and I lay there for several seconds, unable to move. By now the horses had really got the wind under their tails, and they were careering towards the pine forest. It was an eerie sensation as the sounds of the village faded behind us and were replaced by the hiss of the sled runners and the muffled thump of hoofbeats on the snow. We must have covered several versts before I was able to drag myself into a sitting position and take up the reins. My left arm was on fire with pain, and I could see the blood spreading through my tunic sleeve. I tried to move the arm, but it hung there, quite useless. With my right hand I began to regain control of the horses, and after much pulling I coaxed them down to a slow trot. By now I reckoned I was safely out of reach of the village, and could afford to take stock of my situation. I pulled up by a clump of trees and examined my elbow. The shot had passed clean through it, severing the tendons and smashing the bone. Oddly enough, the pain had reduced to a dull ache, and I was sure I could bear it until dawn. Then I resolved I would find another village and get it properly dressed. Meantime, some emergency first aid was required. I tore some strips from the rugs and bound the wound as tightly as I could. Thus secured, I felt my confidence return, and I picked up the coach whip. 2 hours later the snow had stopped, and although still bitterly cold, it was a beautiful night. Big stars embroidered the sky, and pine trees sparkled with frozen drops. I decided to push eastwards, as my earlier study of the local maps had suggested this would bring me to a cluster of tiny villages, nestling at the foothills of a vast mountain range. Regrettably, my sense of geography was not as accurate as it should have been, and within a further 2 hours I was still in the forest, and there was no sign of so much as a molehill, let alone a mountain range. The cold had got to me, and my body felt raw and brittle. My wounded arm had begun to throb, and all in all I felt pretty desperate. The horses, thank God, were still pulling well, and I slumped back in my seat, trying to think of the fortune in gold that lay beneath the rugs of the sled. It was then, quite suddenly, that I heard it for the first time, the thin, chilling, eldritch cry of the wolf. wolves reacted at once, prancing and lunging in their traces, and it was as much as I could do to hold them from bolting. I scanned the trees for signs but saw nothing but snow and darkness and the endless mass of pines. The track sloped forward, and we gathered speed, hissing over the iron-hard ground with its mantle of soft whiteness, until we were clear of the forest and out on a huge, desolate plain. When the wolf cry came the second time, it was much closer and directly to our left. I cut the horses across their backs and drove them immediately into a full gallop. Then I saw the wolves, 50 yards to our left and keeping pace with us. A pack of 8, bounding along with their heads lowered and their tails streaming behind them. The leader was a huge grey with a pointed snout and a curious leaping gait. Although we were going at full tilt, the pack seemed to be merely pacing us, and gave the impression of moving quite effortlessly over the gleaming ground. I knew enough about wolves to be certain that they would keep their distance until they sensed that we were run out. Then they would move in, the leader forming the apex of a V and initiating the attack. I was seized by a fear so strong that I could actually taste it. Savagely I whipped the horses, but already they were beginning to fade, their hoofbeats losing rhythm and their heads plunging as they strained to escape the lash. The wolf pack suddenly veered to the right and reformed directly behind us, closing the gap to a mere 20 yards. I looked over my shoulder and I saw them clearly, like the hounds of hell, the snow flying up from their loping paws, their heads carried low and their devil eyes blazing like rubies. Frantically I seized a box of food from the sled and I tossed it overboard. It bounced in the snow and then burst open, scattering its contents on the wind. The pack ignored it and closed another 10 yards. Now I could see their breath, like plumes of smoke against the freezing air, and their glistening red tongues. The horses were laboring badly, and I knew it was only a matter of minutes before those yellow fangs would sink into my flesh and tear it into bloody ribbons. Sobbing with fear and anguish, I grabbed the nearest gold scepter and heaved it overboard, then the next, and the next, until I had jettisoned all my treasure, and the sled was hundreds of kilos lighter. The horses responded, and with a whoop of triumph I saw the gap widen between the sled and the wolf pack. The plain began to slope forward into what looked like a valley, with outcrops of rock, and on the far side, a dense pine forest. The horses stumbled on the uneven ground, and I saw sparks fly up as one of them struck his hoof on a rock. The wolves moved closer, and the leader raised his head. If any man asks you what it is like to look death in the face, then you could give him no better description. The jaws gaped, and I swear those devil eyes met mine and held to them. What followed seemed like a dream, or even a nightmare. I drew a knife from my belt and hacked off my wounded arm just below the elbow. I can recall to this day how easily the deed was done and how little pain I actually felt. I took the grisly, bloodied object and stood up in the sled, turning to face the pack that was now only 5 yards behind us. "Here!" I screamed at them. "Here's your meat!" I threw the severed arm high in the air and it fell into the middle of the pack. All at once they broke formation and set up a great flurry of snow. I heard snarling and rending and squealing, and then silence. The horses were pulling forward at a ragged trot, and I slid down onto the rugs, sobbing like a madman. I must have passed out, for mercifully I can recall no more, until I arrived at a tiny village with the horses hanging, half dead in their traces.
The old Russian picked up his yellow pipe and relit it with a flourish. For a moment I thought he wouldn't speak again, but he leant towards me and I could smell the harsh tobacco on his breath.
"So, Master Stevenson, that's how I came to lose my arm. There's a tale to tell, eh? You'll take that tale back to England with you, won't you, boy?"
I was about to answer when I felt a hand on my shoulder, turned, and saw my father. He glanced distastefully at the Russian and pulled me to my feet.
"Come on, Paul,"
he said sternly.
"Let's go."
The old Russian reached for a bale of silk, but before he could utter another word, I was being hustled through the crowds to my father's waiting car. It was only later, in the cool of the British residence, that my father allowed me to touch on the subject. We were having tea in the study. My father folded his napkin carefully and placed it on the table.
"Well now, Paul,"
he said.
"what outrageous tale did old Petrovsky tell you then? How he lost his left arm?"
I nodded. "Yes, father. Do you know him?" My father laughed, and I saw his eyes roll as he always did when he was amused.
"Know him?"
said my father.
"I'll say I know this scoundrel. What yarn did he spin this time? Crocodiles in Egypt, perhaps? Or wrestling with a bear in the Himalayas?"
"Neither," I said indignantly. "It was a ravening wolf pack. He threw his arm to them in order to save his life." My father laughed even louder at this and rang the bell for more tea.
"I'll give old Petrovsky his due,"
said my father.
"He's got one hell of an imagination. Do you know, Paul, he tells visitors to the bazaar a different story every day, and they are usually so enthralled that they end up buying his silks at inflated prices. Oddly enough, I know how he really lost his arm, and truth being stranger than fiction, it would make a splendid story in itself. But old Petrovsky won't tell it. He prefers a world of make-believe."
"Tell me what happened, Dad." My father smiled and settled back in his chair.
Balaclava, 1854. Petrovsky was in the Russian guns along the Causeway Heights during the charge of the Light Brigade. One of Lord Cardigan's gallant 17th took off his arm with a sabre cut. The story goes that old Petrovsky was so sickened by the slaughter he saw that day, he resigned the Tsar's commission and came to Istanbul. He's been here ever since.